highlights of the year to hear about what the undergrad fellows have been working on. I think they're going to blow you away with their research. They do me every year. So without further ado, I just want to sort of tell you how things are going to go. We're going to hear from each of the fellows in succession, and then at the end, there'll be about 10 minutes for questions. So please hold your questions until the end, and we'll get to everyone. Okay, so it's my great pleasure to introduce first Cheryl Chung. She's a third-year student majoring in political science and minoring in American Studies and Visual Studies, working under the supervision of Dr. Ryan Hurl to better understand political communications in the digital age. Her project focuses on patterns in ad content and micro-targeting strategies of Republican and Democratic ads leading up to the US 2020 election. Cheryl's talk's called Follow the Money, Understanding the Effect and Implications of American Presidential Campaign Ads on Facebook. Cheryl, please take it away.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome, Professor Davidson. We're gonna jump right into the presentation. I'm no longer a visual studies minor, but maybe some of my artistic skill will show through here. So I really wanted to understand whether the implications of political advertising on Facebook was overblown by the media. And so that's what prompted this research. So Facebook ads are certainly unprecedented in their targeting capacity, meaning who gets to see what, the scale. So Facebook ads are untethered by any constraint of time. They live forever on our news feeds. They could live anywhere, whether your relative on Facebook's in Indonesia or not. And also in interaction. Traditionally, we've viewed newspaper ads, television commercials, and there was no kind of two-way communication. But sponsored posts on Facebook allow users to react to posts, comment with them, and to click through actionable items, thereby allowing advertisers to better understand how effective their advertising is. And so here you could see some examples of a Facebook ad by Donald Trump's campaign and also the kind of targeting parameters available, which include the amount spent, the impressions, and demographic information. And this is a great departure from the very famous Willie Horton or negative ad published in support of Bush, which was only in one variation and broadcasted across America. Okay, so from a theoretical standpoint, this is quite significant because the proliferation of Facebook ads is evidence of Shoshana Zuboff's thesis that we are living in an age of surveillance capitalism where our activities, especially those online, are not only monitored, but also logged for capitalist purposes. And so this means our activity, meaning our comments, our reactions, our shares, they're all stored for marketing agencies and actors with monetary power to pursue their political or commercial ideals. So let's look at what's going on in Canada. We spend about 40 times less what the US has spent, albeit this figure is 1 year in advance. Or 1 year later than the figures available for US total ad spend. Nonetheless, we will only see these costs expand, especially in this anti-regulation age towards big tech. And the last 90 days, about $8,000 was spent on the Justin Trudeau page, meaning that posts on his page may have shown up as sponsored feeds on your news feed, but also the Liberal Party of Canada spends much more money on other pages that advocate for causes from COVID-19 health and safety to matters relating to taxation. So there are a few Facebook ad formats. We've probably not ever seen any direct ads come through on our Messenger. There have been 0 political ads during the American campaign that were published through Messenger. So Instagram and Facebook are the predominant means, and they could be single images, carousels of images, videos, or a collection of products. So if you're buying pants, you can sometimes scroll through the product array. We usually see a lot of videos and actionable images for Facebook ads. For instance, the Brad Parscale team for the Trump 2016 campaign was notoriously able to mobilize a very small amount of ads and just dump them all into please donate Facebook posts, which were argued to be more effective than Hillary Clinton's personality posts demonstrating her capabilities as a political candidate. So there is a paradox of communication. It's kind of like, you could think about it like a wellness product, right? We're critical of capitalism, we're critical of consumption, but we also now understand these kinds of communications and materials as being part of a good citizen. So what does being an informed voter mean? Because a lot of these sponsored Facebook posts are asking us to go vote. So we might want to step back from the narrative that Facebook ads, especially those that are targeted, are evil, but that the line between civic discourse and sponsored discourse is being blurred at the moment. So this was my plan of attack for investigating this sort of vast and unprecedented territory. I've done consultations with professors, and post-COVID, I will be using some of my project funds to survey demonstrators, which is a demographic that cannot be readily accessed via the targeting strategies on Facebook. You have to be on site to see what kinds of people respond to what. I've also conducted literature reviews and reviewed bills and scraped data, cleaned the data. And I think the most important part is sharing the results online, which I will show you how to access later, because this is a short presentation. So right now for me, every fourth post on my Facebook newsfeed is sponsored. And that means when I'm in the zone, when I'm reading about my things, I don't really know what is paid for and what is not. I saw this ad by Tasty, BuzzFeed's Tasty, talking about how Jill Biden makes her favorite family dish. And I did not realize this was an ad because it blends perfectly in with the rest of the brand's products, which are recipe videos. And you can see at the very top of the post, it says sponsored and paid for by Biden for president, meaning it came out of his campaign funds. And also I noticed that the Joe Biden campaign was funneling campaign funds into other journalistic pages, such as GQ, Allure, and also they sponsored some of the posts Barack and Michelle Obama made in support of Joe Biden, which does pull into doubt this kind of authenticity of the narrative we see on our Facebooks. So it's not clear what's being paid for and what's not. Whereas the Trump campaign had their campaign funds going into no journalistic sorts of avenues. All their campaign funds on Facebook ads were made by pages such as Pennsylvania for Trump or Team Trump. So those were a little more explicit, but I think this is a very murky territory. It sets a precedent for how we as citizens will be less able to recognize what is an ad and what's just nonpartisan political communication. And when we trust our journalists this much in this age, it's kind of terrifying to know how much less civic trust there will be should there be more disguised Facebook ads. So I've scraped the data. There's a lot of data, but it shows, so my scraping, I used the Facebook ad library API. It showed that there are very few unique ad variations in terms of text and images, but I also queried over 10,000 rows, meaning that there were very many different strategies for targeting that were tested by an algorithm. So these ads aren't even made by a human, they're monitored by a computer, which speaks to the unprecedented scale today. So you can access more of my work and learn more about the ad library by going to bit.do/ad library. It's kind of a guide I made to understanding what you're looking at and why the problem at hand is so serious. I went to Stanford to audit a few courses last spring, and Professor Shanta Iyengar spoke to me about the lack of transparency, as did Alex Stamos, who was teaching a course at the time. Both were in support of this initiative titled Social Science One, which is a partnership between Nate Persley and Gary King of Harvard, which is to publish all of this data troves on all the URLs available on Facebook. But now the problem, now that it's out, is that you have to request for access, and only educators or academics can request for access. And right now, only about 30 independent agents have access to that data. So it's still very not transparent. But with the transparency, Professor Iyengar did tell me he wants to replicate some of his very famous studies on voter mobilization from the 90s on the digital platform. So once again, it's all a money game. Let's follow the money. Let's see how important political ads are to Facebook's revenue model. So Facebook partakes in a lot of lobbying. They have backed or contributed to 2 bills belonging to the Honest Ads Act. And they also disproportionately back Democrats. This has been shown in the past, but has become more evident in recent years. And you can access all of these figures at opensecrets.org. So at the end of the day, when we follow the money, it could have benefited Trump, it could have benefited Biden, but all these ad spend dollars are going back to Facebook, which is a private organization. And as they are not democratically accountable, as they are largely unregulated because of the unprecedented scale and medium of the social networking site, it's not really clear how we will control this sort of a beast. And so I think the next step for me is to better understand how users interact with ads. And I will be doing that by surveying protesters in DC when I'll be able to do so in the post-COVID era. So I definitely encourage you to access bit.do/ad library, because that is where I've uploaded the cleaned data that I've used for this presentation specifically. That cleaned data will show you the different ad copy in support of Biden and Trump, and also give you a kind of wiki/breakdown on how to access the ad library. Thank you so much for your time.
Great, thank you very much, Cheryl. That was very well done, thank you. Okay, so as I said, we'll hold our questions for Cheryl until, and the other participants until the end. Next, and everyone's perfectly on time. This is awesome. Great. Our next speaker is Ori Gilboa, a third-year student majoring in philosophy and peace, conflict, and justice, working under the supervision of Professor Ron Levy to examine the justifications that legal actors make for legal interventions designed to address cases of war crimes and atrocities. And the title of Ori's talk is "The Banality of Evil on the Depiction of Criminal Motives by Prosecutors at the International Criminal Court." Ori, please.
Hi, thank you so much for the introduction. Let me just share screen. All right, whoop, I think that works. Okay, great. So my title, as mentioned, is "The Banality of Evil, Prosecutorial Characterizations of the Accused at the International Criminal Court." So just a little bit about the ICC before we begin. So the International Criminal Court was established in 1998, and it only started sitting in 2002. So it's a really relatively new international body, and it's really exciting to see how it shapes international law. It's the only permanent international court with jurisdiction to prosecute individuals over crimes of international concern. So those include genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression. So these are quite extraordinary in nature. They're really atrocities of the greatest degree. Prosecutors, the Office of the Prosecutor forms the strategic core of the court. So it largely determines its direction and ethos. And in particular, the opening statements of the prosecution is kind of the apex of prosecutorial performance. And it's really the clearest, most public formulation of their position. I don't know why, oh, there we go. Okay. So my research in particular focused on the theory of crime at the International Criminal Court. Specifically, I was interested to see how prosecutors present the criminal motives of the accused that they're persecuting. And this ties into a larger theory of crime, but it is rooted in how they conceive of why criminals do what they do. Why this is interesting is because prosecutorial strategy is clueless into the court as a whole. As I noted, the prosecution is really the strategic core of the court, and so getting information about their attitudes really can be externalized into the court. And second, whatever legal speculation takes place in the opening statements also informs international criminal law as a whole, given that this is kind of the central body to shape international criminal law outside of more temporary tribunals. Whatever speculation happens during trial can also inform other international legalities. So the first thing I did before actually looking into the opening statements of the prosecution is I wanted to see what the public perception of criminal motives is. I did this because I wanted to see if there's some kind of discrepancy between how the prosecution seems to think about the motives for crimes versus how the public does. So I use newspapers as a proxy for public perception and awareness of the trials. These trials are highly publicized, and so newspapers tend to pick up on trial proceedings and disseminate the information. I only looked at English language newspapers, unfortunately, but I did try to pick a wide variety. And what I found is that while reporters do hint at, and sometimes they explicitly point to, political and financial motives as explanations for the alleged criminal behavior, the focus is not really on those factors. Rather, the narrative seems to be much more honed into ideological explanations. Whether ethnic or religious hate, newspaper coverage of the accused at the ICC tends to focus on motives that are not rooted in personal ambition. Alleged criminals would be seen as motivated by greed, yes, but also by an additional extraordinary circumstance that caused them to commit their crime. This is quite an intuitive outlook. I think by the very egregious nature of the crimes, it's intuitive to also attach a sort of extraordinary motive to that beyond personal motivations. All right, so in order to assess the prosecutorial presentation of the defendant's motives, I examined the opening statements of the 9 cases that made it to the trial phase of proceedings. These opening statements allow the prosecutors to a really unique opportunity to assign a certain personality to the defendant, which either induces identification with or detachment from the main characters at play. In that way, opening statements give an almost literary character to the defendants, creating an opportunity for characterization of their personality as a whole. So after surveying these 9 cases, I found that the theory of crime at the opening statements tends to turn into a theory of greed, ambition, and power. One does not see a deep discussion of the nature of evil. War criminals are instead positioned as strategic and ambitious actors that seek unbridled power. Even the role of ethnicity is sometimes explicitly discounted by the prosecution. This follows the model of what political scientists call the political entrepreneur. These are individuals who manage to mobilize a particular community into conflict in order to further their own ends. Whether monetary or political, the gain they see themselves garnering is the driving force for their violent acts, rather than any deep religious or ethnic conviction. These are rational actors acting in their own self-interest who utilize conflict for their benefits. And this motive, I argue, is ultimately quite banal in nature. Personal gain is not an extraordinary in any means when explaining crime and criminality. Essentially, the prosecutors seem to describe a banal drive expanded onto a larger scale of atrocity. So to give you some ideas of how the ICC actually goes about characterizing these criminals, as you can see, they sometimes explicitly note that the defendant wanted political power. He wanted an army to build their power upon. They invoke the saying, violence was seen as politics by other means. So again, tying political ambition to the violent acts. In one particularly striking case, they actually quote a witness who describes the defendant as a gold digger. So it is quite explicit appeals to personal gain. And on the flip side of the coin, there is sometimes explicit distancing from ethnicity. So the prosecution in one instance says that the trial is not about ethnic origin or an ethnic group. And this emphasis is really is a counter to the narratives we see in the newspapers of ethnicity and religion being the driver of conflict and of violent acts. All right, so why is the discrepancy? So I'm still hammering out the exact explanations for the difference between these two narratives. But I have 4 explanations that I thought of and I'm still working on explaining. So the first one is quite simple. It may be that newspapers, and by extension the public, want to have a more compelling or intuitive narrative of war criminals. So they include extraordinary motives, a sort of heart of darkness narrative to explain people who commit such egregious atrocities. The second reason ties into the geopolitics of the court. So this may be a defensive posture with respect to the charge of politicalization that is often present to the court. The court itself has faced continuous charges of geographic and racial targeting, particularly with respect to Africa. And so the theory of crime that the International Criminal Court adopts may represent a reaction to that geopolitical context that it finds itself in. Instead of presenting African criminals as having being extraordinarily evil in their actions, that might be a very risky political maneuver. The third explanation might just be a strategic consideration from the prosecution. So it might be just easier to prove as a lawyer that someone got personal gain out of whatever atrocity they committed, rather than to show that they harbor some deep-seated hatred towards a particular group. And lastly, there may be just a general resistance to creating an exceptionality to the law. So they want to stick with the status quo of criminological and legalist theory, which is currently very much rooted in these kind of personal, ambitional motives to explain the criminality. Yeah, that's it for me.
Okay, thank you very much, Ori. That was really good. Now we'll move on to Kate Schneider, who is a 4th-year student specializing in political science with a second major in public policy. Her research is supervised by political science professor Christopher Cochran and involves studying political polarization on Twitter, both a Canadian and American context, using social network analysis and natural language processing techniques. Her title of her talk is Following Decisions in Online Clout, the Influence of Canadian Political Leaders on Twitter. Kate, please.
Thank you. Okay, let me just get my screen share set up here. Hopefully you can all see that now. Perfect, okay. So yes, I will be presenting to you my project called Following Decisions and Online Clout, the Influence of Canadian Political Leaders on Twitter. So I hope to convince you by the end of this presentation that the online clout or political influence or sway of Canadian politicians on Twitter, measured by followership, tends to mirror their influence within Parliament and their respective political parties. So just to give you some background on the theory and research question driving my research. So a notable trend observed in Canadian politics over the past century and well documented in scholarly literature is that of the increasing centralization of influence within government. So Savoy has talked about the centralization of political power under the Prime Minister. Backvis and Volanets have talked about the presidentialization of politics in Canada and how our elections are becoming more and more leader-centric. And CES Franks has talked about how the cabinet and prime minister hold significant power over the rest of parliament. So we can visualize this centralization of influence kind of within 2 different hierarchies. So the first here on the left is within parliament, and you've got the prime minister at the top holding the most political influence, followed by cabinet ministers, and then the rest of parliament at the bottom. Within political parties themselves, the party leader sits at the top with the most political influence, followed by frontbenchers who could be cabinet ministers, or in the case of opposition parties, holding critic roles. And then at the bottom, we have backbenchers, which are MPs not assigned portfolios. So my research question is, does the amount of Twitter clout a politician have mirror the level of their parliamentary and political party influence? Or in other words, is Twitter reflective of real life influence? So now I'll talk a little bit about where I got my data. So I decided to measure online political influence through Twitter follower data for 2 reasons. The first is I argue that a higher follower count indicates an increased ability to spread political messages. And second of all, follower count can also be seen kind of as a measure of popularity, as previous research has shown that users generally tend to follow politicians they endorse or support. So to get this data, I used Python to access the Twitter developer REST APIs. I collected all followers of Canadian politicians, so here, federal MPs and senators. 68 senators had accounts, and 323 MPs had accounts, for a total of 391 politicians. And from this data, I got information about just over 6 million unique users and just over 9.6 million following relationships. So to help explain this, if you imagine a given user who follows 2 politicians, that would count as 2 following relationships, but 3 unique users. And I collected this data over late June and early July 2020. So you can see here a list of who the party leaders were during this time period. So now to share some of my findings with you all. So first, just a general distribution of the followers. The bottom axis here tells you the number of followers of each politician. And the vertical axis here on the left tells you how many politicians have that number of followers. So for example, this huge blue bar on the left, leftmost bar, tells us that just under 350 of the politicians have about 16K followers or less. And I tried to break this down a little bit further. So this smaller graph shows the same distribution, but cut off at 20K followers or less. And really we can see that even when you zoom down, you break this down even further, this distribution is very right skewed or positively skewed. Generally, there's just a vast disparity between politicians. Most politicians actually have very few followers, but there are a small handful that have an exceptionally high number. So first, I wanted to test my theory of prime ministerial dominance. So this pie chart here shows us the percentages of total following relationships held by politicians. So in other words, the colored slices here show us the top 5 most followed politicians. So Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, has just over 5 million followers. If you added up the follower count for every other politician together, Justin Trudeau would still have more than all the others combined. So in other words, Justin Trudeau's follower count comprises 52.6% of the sum of all politicians' followers. So this, I argue, would support my notion of prime ministerial dominance online. So next, I wanted to look at this in terms of party leaders. So I broke my data down by party. So for example, with the NDP here on the left, I gathered all users that followed at least one NDP politician. And then I looked at whether these NDP followers followed the leader only, both leader and non-leaders, or only non-leaders. So you can see in the case of the NDP on the left here and the Liberals as well on the right, that party leaders do tend to be followed more than non-leaders. And this trend is seen even more dramatically with the Green Party, where 97.3% of the Green Party followers followed only the party leader, Elizabeth May, at the time. Interestingly, this trend was not observed consistently across all political parties. So in the case of the Bloc Québécois here on the left, about equal proportions of the BQ followers followed the leader only or non-leaders only. And in the case of the Conservative Party on the right, actually a majority of Conservative followers only followed non-leaders. So finally, I wanted to test my theory of frontbencher dominance for the 2 largest parties, the Liberal Party, the governing party, which is in the graph on the left, and the Conservative Party, or the main opposition party, shown here on the right. So Each bar here represents one politician. The front benchers are in yellow and the back benchers are in purple. And front benchers here I'm defining as party leader, a speaker, cabinet, or opposition MP with a critic role during the 42nd or 43rd Parliament. And the height of each of these bars tells you the follower count for that politician. I will note though that this is on a logarithmic scale for visibility. So you can see here that from these graphs, we can tell that the front benchers do tend to be followed more than backbenchers within these two parties. And also another interesting note that I think warrants some future research is you can see there's inflection points here and here on both graphs within the front benchers. So suggesting that perhaps there's even a smaller subset of front benchers who hold even more political influence than the others. So just to summarize some of these findings, the evidence I collected does support the notion of prime ministerial dominance online. In terms of party leader dominance, this pattern is seen for several parties, but there is mixed evidence depending on which political party you're looking at. And then finally, in terms of front bencher dominance, for the two largest parties, the evidence I collected does seem to support this theory. So just to wrap up my presentation, once again, my research question was, does the amount of Twitter clout a politician have mirror the level of their parliamentary and political party influence? Or in other words, is Twitter reflective of real life influence? And hopefully you can take away from this presentation that the online clout of Canadian politicians on Twitter, measured by followership, generally does tend to mirror their influence within Parliament and their respective political parties, although again, this trend is not necessarily seen consistently across all political parties. So if anything, doing this research just gave me a lot more questions that I had going into it. So just a few of these, for example, do MPs get these ministerial appointments because they have a high public profile, or do they gain a higher public profile after being appointed as a minister? I'm also curious to explore next what explains the differences that we see between the political parties. And finally, is Justin Trudeau's dominance on Twitter a result of factors specific to him, or is this something that we will see with future prime ministers as well? So thank you very much for listening to my presentation.
All right. Thank you very much, Kate. That was, yeah, very, very thought-provoking. I noticed Ira in the comments says, fascinating work. It'd be interesting to know if PM dominance extends backwards in time as well. And are there differences across party lines, Harper and Mulroney, Chrétien and Martin? And I was, you can't help but think, Trudeau is such a, he was already kind of a force, right, beforehand. And I wonder what the dynamic would look like with Harper. I don't know. I can't remember him tweeting at all, but maybe you know better than I do. We've got some time for questions for any or all of our participants today. It was a great set of talks. So now please feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself and ask away. Like these, I think it was fascinating to think about, sort of almost to do a discourse analysis, right, of the opening statements and how you alluded to their literary character. Are they aware, and there's the fact that they can potentially influence international criminal law, but in the practical, in the practical side, who exactly are they talking to in the courtroom?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the International Criminal Court has a really unique structure. So there's a panel of judges, and each of them is carefully selected from a particular country of origin, in part to kind of represent all the countries who are signed into the Rome Statute, but also in part to kind of disavow any criticism of it being a sort of Western centric institution. And so you'll find, I think, usually a panel between 9 and 15 judges who are all sitting and listening to the narrative. But I think also additionally, it's important to remember that these trials are so widely publicized that, and especially the opening statements, because that's a big day that follows after 5 or 6 phases of pre-trial. So the trial phase is really the kind of culmination of the narrative that the prosecution is constructing. So they are speaking directly to this panel of judges, but they're also speaking to a very large and wide international community. So I think they are kind of juggling those two audiences.
Okay, great to know. Thank you. Any other questions or concerns for any of the other? If not, I'm going to move on to Cheryl. Cheryl, what you said about civic and sponsored discourse, like it's almost chilling, right? When you think about the extent to which, can you talk, maybe expand a little bit more on that and the work that's been done, you know, sort of parsing those two things and how they may or may not be working together?
Yes. So I believe we can go as far back as to Alexis de Tocqueville, who argued that democracy in America flourishes. My dog wants to contribute too, sorry. In part because it's untethered from the British norms, or the European norms of aristocracy. It's a land in which everyone has equal access to status. And then Robert Putnam builds onto that, saying, okay, you know, now that Americans have these TV sets, no one's going bowling anymore. That's why they're going bowling alone. And there's this deterioration of what he coins as social capital, which is correlated to a decrease in democratic participation. Now, one of the sharp critiques of Putnam's work is people argue, well, is the act of gathering online on an internet forum another means of just bowling together? People are engaging from all corners of the world and engaging in conversation. Isn't that a means to build social capital in a scale never before explored? And now the question of the lines blurring kind of coincides here, right? Because when you have a forum like Reddit, there are technologists who are also ethicists when they're coding, when they're creating an algorithm to decide virality. And so in that sense of the democracy of the digital agora, there already is a kind of sponsorship by a biased party. And I suppose then if you extend Alexis de Tocqueville's observation of American democracy's uniqueness and its status, we no longer see that, because people pulling the ropes at Facebook, deciding how ads are being regulated, when to impose the next political ad ban, have this higher status. And there's this information asymmetry. As consumers, we don't really know whether the ad library is totally correct, because there's no regulation, there's no outside force, third party to decide whether Joe Biden, whom Facebook has aggressively lobbied in support for, has sponsored some other political actors to speak. That does not run with a disclaimer. So this all ties into the kind of mystique of the integrity of not just journalism, but all these other actors in the digital space speaking to us about civic participation. And it is quite terrifying, and definitely not something I think Tocqueville would have foreseen.
Oh, wow. Okay, thank you. And great answer. I think you're ready for your conference. I'm sure if you haven't been going to conferences, you're definitely ready now. Kate, can I just give you some time right at the end here to maybe comment on what Ira Wells said in the chat, and about maybe some comparisons, or how you think, you know, we can play this sort of parlor game to think of how these matchups might have worked in the past or going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is also probably my top question as well. I mean, I think Twitter as a social media platform, because it is relatively new, I mean, social media in general is relatively new. Unfortunately, we don't know too much in terms of like historical trends for like political influence in the online sphere. But another factor that also limited the kind of amount of like historical analysis I was able to do is that Twitter actually does quite limit you in the amount of data that you're allowed to collect. So the data that I collected just over that month period, it took me, because I looked over at June and July, it took me 2 months, because I had to run like a script for like multiple weeks just straight to get this data, because Twitter limits the amount you can collect. But Twitter actually has announced recently that's going to be loosening the restrictions for academic research in the future. So I think this type of historical analysis is an extremely promising area for future research looking at political influence trends over time. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. I see we're right at the end of our time. I would encourage anyone, if you have any questions or leads for any of our young scholars, to get in touch with them or through us at the NFC. And also, I'd just like to really thank all of the undergraduate fellows for your work this year in helping to make us look good. It's so great to be affiliated with people who are sort of getting right into their first big research projects. Yeah, it's just wonderful and great to work with you. I also wanted to thank, since this is the last event, public event of the year, thank Amelia Bailey for all her organization and help during the year. Really, the center would not work without her, and for the continued support of Victoria College. Thank you, Principal Esther Hammer. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of Professor Kevin James, one of our former visiting scholars, who's always been a friend to through the center, as well as thank you, Sherry, for coming. You come to everything. It's very much appreciated. Sharon, also for your help with with supporting scholarship here at Victoria. Ira as well, thank you for all your help, and to John and George for coming out to support your students. So thank you all very much for coming. It's been great, and thank you again. Congratulations, and another round of applause for our undergraduate fellows.